Picture a freezing December morning in 63 BC. Somewhere on the windswept Crimean Peninsula, an old man sits alone in a crumbling fortress. His hands, once steady enough to command armies of hundreds of thousands, now tremble as he lifts a cup of poison to his lips, then drinks again. Nothing happens. The very immunity he spent decades building to protect himself from assassins now prevents him from ending his own life with dignity. In desperation, he turns to his last loyal bodyguard, a Gallic mercenary named Bituitus, and whispers a final command. The sword falls. Thus dies Mithridates VI Eupator, the Poison King, Rome's most dangerous enemy since Hannibal murdered, not by Roman legions, but by his own careful preparations. But how did we get here? How did a hunted 11-year-old boy become the last great king to seriously threaten Roman supremacy? That story begins 60 years earlier, in a palace dripping with treachery and poison. The year was 120 BC. The place, the royal court at Sinope, a gleaming white city on the Black Sea coast where Greek civilization met Persian grandeur. King Mithridates V of Pontus lay dead poisoned at a banquet, his killers never identified. Political assassination was hardly unusual in the cutthroat world of Hellenistic kingdoms, but this particular murder would reshape the ancient world in ways nobody could have predicted. The throne passed to the dead king's 11-year-old son, Mithridates VI, Eupator. The boy's name itself proclaimed divine favor, beloved of his father in Greek, linking him to the Persian royal lineage that the Pontic dynasty claimed through Darius the Great. But divine ancestry wouldn't save him from what came next. His mother, Laodice, had other plans. Following Hellenistic royal custom, she'd married her own brother, a practice meant to keep power concentrated within the family, though it often bred monsters instead. Now widowed and serving as regent for her young son, Laodice looked upon Mithridates with cold calculation. She favored the younger boy, Mithridates, Crestus malleable, controllable, everything the fierce-eyed older prince was not. Young Mithridates understood his situation with a clarity beyond his years. A regency under a hostile mother meant one thing: a convenient accident, a fatal illness, a cup of wine that tasted just slightly wrong. So he made a choice that would define his entire life. He vanished. The official story spoke of extended hunting expeditions in the rugged Pontic mountains, but Mithridates' disappearance was something far more profound, a self-imposed exile that would forge a boy into a weapon. For 7 years, from age 11 to 18, the rightful king of Pontus lived rough in the wilderness. He slept under stars. He survived on roots and game. He trained his body to endure cold that would kill lesser men. And he did something no one had ever attempted before. He became immune to poison. Ancient sources describe his methodology with a mixture of awe and horror. The young prince systematically consumed small doses of every toxic plant, every venomous creature, every lethal substance that grew in Pontic soil. He started with amounts barely enough to taste, gradually increasing over months and years, building tolerance, creating within his own flesh an immunity that would become legendary. Mithridatism, they would later call it, the practice of protecting oneself through controlled exposure to poison. But it wasn't just about survival. During those 7 years of exile, Mithridates built something his mother could never have anticipated: loyalty. Not the bought loyalty of courtiers, but the earned devotion of mountain chieftains and tribal warriors who controlled Pontus's interior regions. These hardened men of the highlands saw something in the young prince, a steel core that reminded them of wolves, of winter storms, of things that refused to break. When Mithridates finally returned to Sinope at age 18, he came not as a supplicant but as a conqueror, backed by armed men who would die for him. What emerged from those mountains was extraordinary. A man of imposing physical presence, standing taller than most, powerfully built, with the aquiline features of his Persian ancestors. But it was his eyes that people remembered intelligent, calculating, utterly pitiless. His mother and brother disappeared from historical records shortly after his return. The sources maintain a discreet silence about their fates, but in the ruthless calculus of Hellenistic monarchy, mercy was a luxury dead king's sons could not afford. Laodice had taught her son one crucial lesson. Family was just another word for potential assassins. Now, alone and unchallenged on the Pontic throne, Mithridates looked outward at a world in transition. The old Hellenistic kingdoms, those glittering successors to Alexander's empire, were crumbling, and a new power was rising in the west, brutal and efficient: Rome. The Roman Republic in 113 BC wasn't yet the unstoppable empire of later centuries, but its shadow already stretched across the Mediterranean like a stain. In 133 BC, through the peculiar bequest of King Attalus III of Pergamum, Rome had acquired one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the East. They'd rebranded it as the province of Asia, encompassing much of western Anatolia, the jewel of the eastern Mediterranean, and they were squeezing it dry. The system Rome developed for extracting wealth from conquered territories was both brilliant and brutal. They called it the publicani system, tax farming. On an industrial scale, Roman equestrians would purchase the right to collect taxes for predetermined periods. Their profit came from whatever they could squeeze beyond the official amount. Oversight was minimal. Incentives for restraint were non-existent. The result? Systematic exploitation that made modern corporate raiders look like philanthropists. Greek cities that had initially welcomed Roman intervention as liberation from Seleucid oppression discovered their new masters could be equally rapacious and far less respectful of Hellenic culture. Roman officials, trained in the pragmatic traditions of republican administration, had little patience for the elaborate protocols and ceremonies central to Greek civic life. To Greeks, who measured civilization by philosophical sophistication and artistic achievement, Roman directness seemed crude, almost barbaric. But it was the economic pressure that truly ground people down. Rural communities, lacking resources and political connections to resist publicani demands, found themselves forced into debt servitude when unable to meet tax obligations. Entire villages watched as their land was seized and sold to Roman investors. Traditional social structures that had maintained stability for centuries began fracturing under the strain. Urban communities fared somewhat better due to greater resources and more sophisticated political organizations. But even the most prosperous Greek cities found their autonomy increasingly circumscribed by Roman financial demands. The ancient traditions of civic benefaction, whereby wealthy citizens funded public works and festivals, came under severe strain as private fortunes were depleted by Roman taxation. And Mithridates watched all this from his palace in Sinope. He understood something crucial. Beneath the surface prosperity of Roman Asia lay a reservoir of resentment so deep that the right catalyst could transform it into an explosion. But first, he needed to build the power base that would allow him to exploit that weakness. His first target was Colchis, the legendary land of the Golden Fleece, located on the Black Sea's eastern shore. This region, rich in gold and precious metals, maintained nominal independence under local rulers while serving as a crucial link in trade networks connecting the Mediterranean with the Caucasus and Central Asia. Mithridates couldn't rely solely on military force, given the difficult terrain and distance from Pontic population centers. Instead, he employed something more subtle, a combination of diplomacy, economic pressure, and strategic marriages to gradually extend Pontic influence. Local chieftains were offered advantageous trading arrangements and positions within the expanding Pontic administrative system. Those who resisted faced coordinated military campaigns that exploited Pontus's superior naval capabilities. The incorporation of Colchis brought immediate strategic benefits. Control of gold mines provided substantial new revenue streams, Access to Caucasian trade routes opened opportunities for expansion into previously untapped markets. Perhaps most importantly, Colchis served as a launching point for further expansion into the Crimean Bosporus. The Bosporan kingdom, centered on Greek cities like Pantikapaeum and Chersonesus, controlled something perhaps even more valuable than gold: the grain trade between Scythian territories north of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean world. For centuries, these cities had maintained precarious independence through military strength, diplomatic skill, and regular tribute payments to local barbarian tribes. By the late 2nd century BC, however, that balance was collapsing. Scythian power was waning under pressure from migrating Sarmatian tribes, while Greek cities found themselves unable to maintain military forces sufficient to guarantee continued independence. Appeals to Mediterranean powers for assistance yielded little concrete support. Mithridates saw the opportunity and seized it. His intervention began with diplomatic overtures, offering military assistance against barbarian raids in exchange for commercial privileges and naval bases. When negotiations proved insufficient, he dispatched a substantial military force under his most trusted general, Diophantus. The subsequent campaigns demonstrated the effectiveness of Pontic military organization, combining Pontic heavy infantry with local auxiliaries and allied tribal cavalry. Diophantus's forces proved superior to both declining Scythian armies and the limited forces Greek cities could field independently. The capture of key strategic points allowed Pontic forces to establish permanent bases while securing land routes connecting Crimean cities with their agricultural hinterlands. By 110 BC, Mithridates controlled Bosporan grain exports, giving him both substantial revenue and a powerful diplomatic weapon that could be wielded against any Mediterranean power dependent on Black Sea grain. The Greek cities themselves, with their experienced naval forces and established commercial networks, became valuable assets in his growing confrontation with Rome. But Mithridates understood something many ambitious kings forgot. Power without legitimacy is just organized violence. He needed to transform himself from successful warlord into something grander, a liberator, a defender of Greek civilization against Roman barbarism, the rightful heir to Alexander's dream of a unified East. So he cultivated that image with careful deliberation. His court at Sinope became a center of Hellenistic culture, attracting philosophers, artists, and scholars. He commissioned works proclaiming his descent from both Persian royalty and Alexander the Great. He presented himself to Greek audiences as their natural protector, the king who understood their culture because he embodied it. To Persian populations, he was the restoration of a Achaemenid glory that Rome threatened to extinguish. This dual identity, Greek and Persian, West and East, would prove instrumental in uniting diverse populations against Roman rule. But for all his growing power, Mithridates understood that direct confrontation with Rome remained premature. The Republic, despite internal tensions and provincial exploitation, still commanded military resources that dwarfed those of any single Eastern kingdom. He would need more than Pontic soldiers. He would need allies. He would need Rome itself to provide justification for war. And he would need Romans to make the first mistake. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction: succession crises in the client kingdoms of Bithynia and Cappadocia. When King Nicomedes III of Bithynia died in 94 BC, a succession dispute erupted. The legitimate heir, Nicomedes IV, faced opposition from his half-brother Socrates, who enjoyed backing from anti-Roman factions. Rome threw its support behind Nicomedes IV, while simultaneously attempting to install their own candidate in neighboring Cappadocia, where King Ariarathes VI's death in 101 BC had triggered a similar crisis. Mithridates observed these developments with calculating eyes. Roman positions in both kingdoms remained precarious, dependent on local support that could evaporate if alternative leadership emerged. More importantly, Roman military resources in the region remained limited. Most legions were committed to campaigns in Gaul, Spain, and other frontier regions. The king's diplomatic offensive began in earnest during 91 BC. Embassies were dispatched to both Cappadocia and Bithynia, offering military assistance to rival claimants opposed by Rome. The terms were deliberately generous: substantial financial support and military advisors in exchange for formal alliances that would effectively place both kingdoms within Mithridates' sphere of influence. Roman intelligence services failed to detect the full scope of these diplomatic maneuvers until events had progressed beyond peaceful resolution. The consul Manius Aquilius, dispatched to Asia Minor with a small force to resolve the succession disputes, discovered both kingdoms were already effectively under Pontic influence by the time he arrived. His attempts to negotiate directly with Mithridates through traditional diplomatic channels met with polite but evasive responses. The Pontic king was buying time, completing military preparations, positioning forces. The breakdown of negotiations occurred during winter 90 to 89 BC at meetings along the Pontic-Cappadocian border. Aquilius, operating under Senate instructions to resolve the crisis without committing substantial Roman resources, found himself making threats he lacked military capacity to enforce. Mithridates, fully aware of Roman limitations, responded to each ultimatum with counter-proposals that would have effectively recognized Pontic hegemony over disputed territories while maintaining the fiction of Roman oversight. The final exchange came in early 89 BC, when Aquilius delivered what amounted to an ultimatum: withdraw all support from rival claimants and recognize Roman authority over both succession disputes. Mithridates' response, delivered through his ambassador Pelopidas, was a masterpiece of diplomatic doublespeak that couldn't disguise the fundamental rejection. The king would consider withdrawing from Cappadocia only if Rome simultaneously recognized Pontic sovereignty over territories that included most of northern and eastern Asia, minor terms no Roman official could possibly accept without effectively abandoning the province of Asia. With diplomatic options exhausted, both sides began final preparations, but only one side was truly ready. Spring 88 BC, Mithridates launched his offensive with coordinated assaults that demonstrated years of careful planning. Rather than advancing directly against Roman positions, he secured his flanks through simultaneous invasions of Bithynia and Cappadocia that eliminated Rome's preferred candidates and installed his own puppets on both thrones. These campaigns, executed by separate armies under experienced Pontic generals, achieved their objectives within weeks. The speed of success reflected both superior intelligence and more effective logistics. Mithridates had spent years cultivating relationships with local commanders in both kingdoms, ensuring resistance would be minimal. The Bithynian campaign unfolded with particular efficiency. Pontic forces, advancing from multiple directions, converged on the capital at Nicomedia, while naval units secured coastal cities. King Nicomedes IV, faced with the choice between flight and capture, abandoned his kingdom and fled to Roman protection. The installation of Socrates as the new Bithynian king emphasized continuity with traditional customs, while making clear the kingdom's new orientation toward Pontus. Cappadocia proved even more receptive. Years of Roman interference had generated substantial resentment among traditional nobility. The new king immediately signed a formal alliance granting Mithridates access to Cappadocian military resources and strategic positions. With flanks secured and reliable allies installed, Mithridates turned attention to the main prize, the Roman province of Asia. The campaign that followed would demonstrate not only his military capabilities, but also the extent of anti-Roman sentiment that had been building for decades. The invasion began with simultaneous assaults on multiple fronts, designed to prevent Roman forces from concentrating their limited resources. The main Pontic army, Approximately 250,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry, according to contemporary sources, advanced westward from Cappadocia. Smaller forces moved south from Bithynia. Additional units landed at various points along the coastline. This multi-pronged assault forced Roman commanders to divide already inadequate forces while dealing with uprisings in rear areas as local populations welcomed the Pontic advance. The fall of Pergamum occurred within days. The city's Greek population, resentful of decades of Roman exploitation, opened gates to Pontic forces. Mithridates' entry into Pergamum was orchestrated as deliberate contrast to Roman practices. The king presented himself as a liberator, restoring traditional Greek freedoms, rather than a conqueror, imposing foreign rule. The enthusiastic reception he received throughout Greek cities of Asia Minor reflected genuine popular support rather than mere opportunism. Ephesus, the largest and most prosperous city in the province, surrendered without resistance. The population had already expelled Roman tax farmers and their local collaborators, seizing their property and establishing a provisional government that immediately declared allegiance to Mithridates. The collapse of Roman military resistance proceeded with shocking rapidity. Garrison after garrison found itself isolated and outnumbered by hostile local populations. Aquilius himself, caught when the provincial capital fell, managed to escape, but found himself unable to rally effective resistance anywhere. His eventual capture near the Bithynian border marked the effective end of organized Roman resistance in Asia Minor, and then came the day that would ensure any Roman response would be equally ruthless. Secret orders, distributed throughout the region weeks in advance and coordinated to ensure simultaneous execution, called for the systematic elimination of all Roman and Italian civilians residing in cities and towns of Asia Minor. The king's instructions were explicit. Every man, woman, and child of Roman or Italian birth was to be killed, regardless of age, social status, or length of residence. The massacre began at dawn in Ephesus and spread throughout the province. Local populations, armed with lists of Roman residents prepared by Pontic agents, conducted house-to-house searches. The killing was not random violence, but carefully organized genocide designed to eliminate any possibility of Roman resurgence. Entire families were dragged from homes and murdered in public squares, while crowds watched and cheered. Roman merchants who'd lived in Asia Minor for decades, their children born in Greek cities, elderly veterans who'd settled after completing military service, all killed without distinction or mercy. Contemporary sources, both Pontic sympathizers and later Roman historians, agree on the scale. Approximately 80,000 Roman and Italian civilians perished in a single day across Asia Minor. The Ephesian Vespers, as it became known, demonstrated that Mithridates was prepared to wage total war against Roman authority, rejecting traditional limitations that had governed conflicts between civilized powers. News of the massacre reached Rome several weeks later. Initial reports were dismissed as exaggerated accounts of routine military violence, but subsequent confirmations from multiple sources forced Roman authorities to confront reality. An entire provincial population had been eliminated in a coordinated act of genocide. The Senate's response combined genuine shock at the scale of the atrocity with recognition that Roman prestige throughout the Mediterranean world had suffered a devastating blow. Something would have to be done. Someone would have to answer for this. But Rome's response would have to wait, because as Mithridates consolidated control over Asia Minor and Romans reeled from unprecedented civilian losses, a different crisis was brewing in Rome itself, one that would prove almost as destructive as anything happening in the East. The man who would eventually lead Rome's response was about to march on Rome with his own legions, setting a precedent that would ultimately destroy the Republic itself. The catastrophic news from Asia Minor arrived in Rome during autumn 88 BC, at the worst possible moment. The Republic was already convulsing with internal violence that would fundamentally alter everything. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician of ancient lineage, whose family had fallen into obscurity before his own military successes revived their fortunes, found himself at the center of a constitutional crisis that would set precedents more dangerous than anything Mithridates could accomplish. The Senate had formally assigned Sulla command of the Eastern expedition, recognizing both the magnitude of the Pontic threat and Sulla's proven capabilities demonstrated during the social war against Italian allies. His appointment represented a calculated decision by conservatives who viewed the patrician general as a reliable defender of traditional institutions against populist challenges. But Gaius Marius, the aging general, whose victories over Jugurtha and Germanic tribes had made him the most celebrated commander of his generation, emerged from political retirement to challenge Sulla's appointment through manipulation of popular assemblies. The tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus introduced legislation transferring command from Sulla to Marius, arguing the crisis required Rome's most experienced general. What happened next was unprecedented. Sulla refused to accept the decision. Instead, he marched on Rome with the 6 legions assembled for the Eastern campaign. No Roman general had ever led armed forces against the capital itself, but Sulla calculated that constitutional principles took precedence over popular will, and that the Republic's institutions required protection against demagogic manipulation. The brief civil conflict that followed demonstrated both the fragility of Republican institutions and the extent to which personal loyalties had begun to supersede constitutional obligations. Marius and supporters, lacking organized military forces within the city, attempted resistance through hastily armed urban militias and gladiatorial bands. These improvised forces proved no match for disciplined legions commanded by experienced officers. Fighting occurred within Rome itself. Roman citizens engaged in armed conflict with their own military forces. The precedent was set. The Rubicon, we might say, had been crossed decades before Caesar would make it famous. Sulla's victory was complete, but Pyrrhic. Marius fled into exile. But the precedent of marching on Rome would haunt the Republic for the remainder of its existence. With his domestic position temporarily secured, Sulla departed for the east in early 87 BC, leaving behind a political situation that remained fundamentally unstable. The Roman expeditionary force that crossed from Brundisium to Apollonia in spring 87 BC represented one of the largest military concentrations the Republic had assembled for foreign operations since the Punic Wars. 5 legions, approximately 30,000 men, formed the corps, supported by substantial auxiliary forces. Sulla's arrival in Epirus coincided with disturbing intelligence. Pontic influence had spread far beyond Asia Minor. Mithridates had dispatched substantial forces under General Archelaus to secure key strategic positions throughout Greece. Pontic agents had been active, encouraging anti-Roman sentiment among Greek communities that retained bitter memories of previous Roman interventions. Athens was particularly alarming. The democratic faction led by Aristion had seized control and declared allegiance to Pontus. Similar uprisings had occurred in other major Greek centers. The strategic situation required immediate action to prevent consolidation of Pontic control over Greece and Aegean islands. The siege of Athens, that commenced in autumn 87 BC, would demonstrate both Sulla's tactical capabilities and his willingness to employ extreme measures. The city's formidable fortifications, strengthened during previous centuries of warfare, presented significant challenges. The presence of Pontic naval forces at Piraeus complicated any attempt to establish complete blockade. Sulla's approach combined traditional siege methods with innovative tactical adaptations designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Athenian defensive arrangements. Roman siege lines completely encircled both Athens and its port at Piraeus, including elaborate systems of trenches, palisades, and artillery positions that prevented relief efforts, while protecting Roman forces from sorties. But Sulla understood that psychological warfare could be as effective as physical assault. Rather than attempting immediate assault on walls, he implemented systematic intimidation designed to undermine civilian morale. Roman artillery maintained constant bombardment of residential areas. Public executions of captured Pontic sympathizers provided graphic demonstrations of the fate awaiting those who opposed Roman authority. The gradual tightening created increasingly desperate conditions within Athens as food supplies dwindled and disease spread through the overcrowded population. Aristion's government, initially confident that Pontic relief forces would break the blockade, found itself unable to maintain civilian support as reality became apparent. The final assault began before dawn on March 1st, 86 BC. Roman forces simultaneously attacked multiple sections of walls, while diversionary operations prevented the garrison from concentrating defensive efforts. The main attack, directed against the Pyrrhic Gate where bombardment had weakened fortifications, achieved breakthrough within hours. And then Sulla unleashed hell. The sack of Athens that followed represented one of the most brutal episodes in Roman warfare history. Sulla permitted his troops to engage in systematic pillaging and massacre that continued for 3 days. Thousands of civilians were killed, regardless of political affiliations. The city's artistic and cultural treasures were either destroyed or shipped to Rome as spoils. Can you imagine? The city of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the birthplace of democracy itself, reduced to smoking ruins by men who claimed to represent civilization. The destruction sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world. The systematic elimination of Athens's intellectual and cultural elite demonstrated that Rome would tolerate no challenges to its authority, regardless of cultural significance. The capture of Piraeus required separate operations, as the Pontic garrison under Archelaus had fortified the port and maintained naval communications with reinforcements. Sulla's assault demonstrated tactical innovations that would characterize subsequent campaigns, coordinated attacks by land and sea that overwhelmed defensive positions through superior organization. With Athens secured and Pontic naval power in the Aegean significantly reduced, Sulla turned attention to elimination of remaining enemy forces in central Greece. Archelaus, having escaped from Piraeus with substantial portions of his army, had established new positions in Boeotia, where he hoped to await reinforcements while organizing resistance. The Battle of Chaeronea, fought on the plains of central Boeotia in summer 86 BC, demonstrated the tactical superiority of Roman military organization. Archelaus had positioned his army, estimated at approximately 110,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, in a strong defensive position that took advantage of local terrain while allowing maximum deployment of superior numbers. But Sulla's tactical innovations neutralized these advantages through coordinated maneuvers that exploited weaknesses in Pontic command and control systems. The Roman victory shattered Pontic military power in Greece and forced Archelaus to retreat with remnants toward the coast. Sulla's pursuit was methodical and relentless, preventing the enemy from establishing new defensive positions. News of Roman success began reversing the tide of regional opinion. Greek communities that had welcomed Mithridates as liberator now recognized that Roman power remained formidable, and continued resistance would likely result in the same brutal punishment that had befallen Athens. Delegations began arriving at Sulla's headquarters, offering submission and requesting terms for renewed alliance. The financial aspects of Sulla's settlement revealed practical considerations that accompanied any restoration of Roman authority. The costs of maintaining substantial military forces in the field for extended periods had strained the Roman treasury. The solution involved imposing massive indemnities on communities that had supported Pontus, while offering favorable commercial arrangements to those demonstrating renewed loyalty. Meanwhile, the military situation had evolved to where Mithridates faced increasing pressure to seek negotiated settlement rather than continue a conflict depleting his resources without achieving decisive results. Roman control of Greece had eliminated his forward bases in the western Aegean. Growing unrest within Asia Minor itself indicated that his initial popularity was beginning to erode under pressures of sustained warfare. The Treaty of Dardanus, negotiated in 85 BC, reflected military realities that had developed over the war's course. Mithridates agreed to evacuate all territories outside his original kingdom boundaries, including Cappadocia, Bithynia, and Greek cities of Asia Minor that had declared for Pontus. The king would also surrender his naval forces beyond those necessary for coastal defense and pay substantial indemnity of 2,000 talents. In exchange, Rome recognized Mithridates as legitimate ruler within ancestral territories and agreed to restore normal diplomatic relations. The treaty specifically acknowledged Pontic sovereignty over Black Sea territories, acquired before hostilities, including Colchis and the Crimean Bosporus, while establishing procedures for resolving future disputes through negotiation. Yet this peace was fundamentally unstable. Both sides understood underlying issues remained unresolved. Rome had demonstrated military superiority, but had not eliminated the Pontic threat. Mithridates had been forced back to original boundaries, but retained both will and capacity to challenge Roman authority when circumstances became more favorable. The uneasy peace lasted barely 2 years, before renewed conflict erupted not from calculated policy decisions, but from personal ambitions of Lucius Licinius Murena, the Roman governor of Asia, who viewed Mithridates' apparent compliance with treaty obligations as evidence of weakness rather than diplomatic prudence. Murena initiated unauthorized military operations against Pontus in 83 BC, with coordinated attacks against Pontic border fortifications along the Cappadocian frontier. These assaults, conducted without formal declaration of war or Senate authorization, achieved immediate tactical success as surprised Pontic garrisons found themselves overwhelmed. Mithridates' initial response revealed sophisticated defensive strategy developed during the interwar period. Rather than immediately committing major forces to defend frontier positions, Pontic commanders implemented flexible defense that traded territory for time while gathering intelligence about Roman intentions. The first significant Pontic military response came in late 83 BC, when Mithridates authorized limited counterattacks against overextended Roman positions. The battle fought near the village of Halys marked the first significant engagement since the previous war's conclusion, demonstrating that Mithridates had succeeded in creating military forces capable of defeating Roman units under favorable conditions. Murena's response to his tactical defeat revealed both personal determination to achieve military success and growing recognition that his forces were inadequate for ambitious objectives he'd originally envisioned. The diplomatic resolution that Sulla engineered reflected pragmatic approach to both military and political challenges. Direct communications with Mithridates emphasized Rome's commitment to existing treaty arrangements while acknowledging that Murena's actions had exceeded his authority. Orders were dispatched to Murena requiring him to cease offensive operations and withdraw forces to original positions. The recall from his Asian command avoided any formal acknowledgement that the governor had acted improperly, while ensuring future operations would be conducted under closer supervision. The brief war had served primarily to test military improvements both sides had implemented, while demonstrating that fundamental strategic balance remained essentially unchanged. But the real storm was still gathering. In 75 BC, King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia died, bequeathing his entire kingdom to the Roman people in his will, an act that would trigger the final, most devastating phase of the Mithridatic Wars. The legal and political implications were immediately apparent. Roman acceptance would create a direct territorial border between Pontus and Roman provincial administration for the first time. The strategic significance of Bithynia extended far beyond its modest territorial extent. The kingdom controlled crucial overland routes connecting Asia Minor with the Balkans, while its ports provided essential naval bases for any power seeking to dominate the Propontis and approaches to the Black Sea. Roman control would effectively encircle Pontus and provide launching points for future military operations against Mithridates' core territories. The Senate's deliberations revealed deep divisions about accepting territorial acquisitions that would inevitably provoke renewed conflict, but ultimately, ambition and strategic calculation won out. The Senate accepted the bequest. War was now inevitable. Mithridates received confirmation of Roman intentions through his extensive intelligence network weeks before official announcements were made, allowing him to accelerate military preparations that had been developing systematically throughout the interwar period. But this time, the king had prepared something unprecedented, a grand alliance that would force Rome to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The cornerstone was formal military alliance with Tigranes II of Armenia, whose expanding kingdom had emerged as dominant power in eastern Anatolian highlands. Tigranes commanded substantial military resources, including renowned Armenian heavy cavalry, while his territorial acquisitions in Syria and Mesopotamia provided strategic depth and additional sources of military recruitment. Simultaneously, Mithridates pursued alliance negotiations with Quintus Sertorius, the Roman general whose independent state in Spain represented both potential source of military expertise and strategic diversion that would prevent Rome from concentrating all available resources against Eastern opponents. Perhaps most innovative was alliance with Mediterranean pirates, maritime forces that controlled sea routes throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, while possessing naval capabilities necessary to disrupt Roman communications and supply lines. These piratical organizations had expanded dramatically during previous decades, taking advantage of the power vacuum created by decline of traditional naval powers. The invasion of Bithynia commenced in spring 74 BC, with coordinated assaults demonstrating both the scale of Pontic military capabilities and effectiveness of strategic planning. Rather than single-axis advance, Mithridates implemented multi-pronged offensive that attacked Roman positions from several directions simultaneously. The main Pontic army, approximately 150,000 infantry and 16,000 cavalry, advanced directly from Pontus toward the Bithynian capital at Nicomedia, while secondary forces moved through Paphlagonia and along coastal routes to secure key strategic positions before Roman reinforcements could arrive. The speed of Pontic success in opening phases reflected both superior numbers and better intelligence about Roman defensive arrangements. Bithynian cities that had reluctantly accepted Roman administration welcomed Pontic forces as liberators. The Roman military response required appointment of capable commanders who could coordinate complex operations across vast distances. The Senate's decision to appoint Lucius Licinius Lucullus and Marcus Aurelius Cotta as joint commanders reflected recognition that the Eastern crisis required both substantial military resources and experienced leadership. Lucullus, assigned primary responsibility for land operations, brought methodical approach to warfare that emphasized careful preparation, superior logistics, and systematic reduction of enemy capabilities through sustained pressure rather than decisive battles. His previous experience as Sulla's quaestor during the First Mithridatic War had provided detailed knowledge of Pontic military organization. The siege of Cyzicus, which began in late 74 BC, would provide the first major test of both Pontic military improvements and Roman adaptive capabilities. Mithridates had concentrated approximately 300,000 troops around this crucial Greek city, whose strategic position on the Propontis made it essential for controlling communications between Asia Minor and European territories that might provide reinforcements to Roman forces. But Lucullus recognized that direct assault on Pontic siege lines would likely result in catastrophic Roman casualties without achieving decisive results. Instead, the Roman commander implemented strategy that combined naval operations with coordinated attacks on Pontic supply lines, designed to force Mithridates to abandon the siege through logistical pressure rather than military defeat. The naval blockade that Cotta established around the Propontis represented the first successful Roman challenge to Pontic maritime supremacy since the beginning of the current war. Roman squadrons operating from bases in Aegean islands implemented coordinated patrol patterns that interdicted Pontic supply ships while protecting their own communications. The gradual tightening of Roman naval control created increasing logistical difficulties for Mithridates' massive army. The king's supply requirements exceeded the capacity of overland transportation routes to maintain adequate provisions. The Pontic army's size, which had initially appeared to guarantee rapid success through overwhelming numerical superiority, became a strategic liability. The breakthrough in Roman operations came during spring 73 BC, when coordinated naval and land attacks succeeded in severing primary Pontic supply routes, while simultaneously threatening the siege army's lines of retreat toward Pontus proper. The collapse of the Pontic position around Cyzicus occurred with shocking rapidity once Roman forces achieved their initial breakthrough. Mithridates discovered that his elaborate siege works had become a trap, preventing effective withdrawal of his massive army. The king's attempts to organize fighting retreats were frustrated by logistical chaos that resulted from sudden abandonment of supply depots and siege equipment, while Roman pursuit operations inflicted devastating casualties on Pontic units that had lost organizational cohesion. Contemporary sources describe the retreat as one of the most complete military disasters in ancient warfare, with Pontic losses exceeding 200,000 casualties from all causes, including combat, disease, and desertion. The strategic implications extended far beyond immediate tactical results. The destruction of Mithridates' primary field army eliminated offensive capabilities that had enabled Pontic expansion, while demonstrating to potential allies that Roman military power remained formidable, despite initial setbacks. But Lucullus understood that military success required consolidation through political and administrative measures that would prevent enemy recovery. Rather than immediately pursuing Mithridates into Pontic territory, the Roman commander implemented comprehensive program designed to restore Roman authority throughout recovered territories, while building logistical foundations necessary for sustained operations against enemies' core strongholds. This methodical approach frustrated subordinates who favored immediate pursuit, but it created conditions that would enable eventual decisive victory through systematic pressure rather than risky direct assault. The systematic conquest of Pontus proper began in earnest during 72 BC, as Lucullus advanced methodically through the kingdom's border regions while implementing siege operations against fortified cities. The fall of Sinope, Pontus's principal port city and administrative center, demonstrated sophisticated siege techniques that Roman engineers had developed. The city fell after months of sustained effort, providing Roman forces with a crucial strategic position that controlled access to the Black Sea region. And still, Mithridates refused to surrender. Mithridates' strategic retreat to Armenia during 70 BC represented a calculated decision to preserve remaining military capabilities while seeking alliance support that might enable eventual recovery of lost territories. The king's analysis of his strategic position recognized that continued resistance within Pontus proper would likely result in complete destruction of remaining forces without achieving meaningful results, while withdrawal to Armenian territory would provide secure bases for reorganization while potentially drawing Roman forces into unfavorable strategic positions. The alliance between Mithridates and Tigranes II had evolved substantially since its initial formation. The Armenian king had expanded territorial control throughout Syria and Mesopotamia, while building military capabilities that rivaled those of any contemporary power. Tigranes commanded approximately 100,000 infantry and 55,000 cavalry, according to contemporary estimates, while his control of wealthy commercial centers provided financial resources that could support sustained military operations. Lucullus's decision to pursue the war into Armenia during 69 BC represented one of the most controversial strategic choices of his entire command. It extended Roman military commitments far beyond original objectives that had motivated the war, while creating logistical challenges that would strain Roman capabilities to their limits. The Roman commander's strategic assessment emphasized the necessity of eliminating Mithridates completely, rather than allowing him to recover in Armenian exile. The logistical preparations necessary for Roman operations in Armenia required unprecedented coordination between military and civilian authorities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The distances involved exceeded anything previously attempted by Roman forces, while terrain presented formidable obstacles to traditional supply methods. Lucullus established a complex network of supply depots and communication stations that extended from the Aegean coast through central Anatolia to the Armenian frontier. The Battle of Tigranocerta, fought in autumn 69 BC, would demonstrate both the continued effectiveness of Roman tactical methods and the strategic limitations that prevented decisive victory despite overwhelming tactical success. Tigranes had concentrated approximately 150,000 troops in defensive positions around his capital city, confident that numerical superiority and favorable terrain would enable Armenian forces to achieve the kind of decisive victory that had eluded Mithridates during his previous confrontations with Roman armies. But Lucullus's tactical approach reflected systematic analysis of Armenian military capabilities, combined with innovations designed to exploit specific weaknesses in enemy deployments. Rather than attempting direct assault against Armenian defensive positions, Roman forces implemented coordinated maneuvers that drew enemy cavalry into unfavorable engagements, while maintaining sufficient cohesion to resist counterattacks by Armenian infantry reserves. The battle's outcome demonstrated that Roman tactical superiority remained decisive under favorable conditions. Armenian forces suffered catastrophic casualties, while Roman losses remained minimal, despite numerical disparity. The capture of Tigranocerta provided Roman forces with enormous quantities of treasure and military supplies, while demonstrating to potential allies throughout the region that even the most powerful eastern kingdoms could not successfully resist Roman military capabilities. Yet these achievements extended Roman commitments far beyond what the Senate had originally authorized, while creating administrative burdens that exceeded available resources. The wealth captured at Tigranocerta, while substantial, proved insufficient to fund ongoing military operations necessary to consolidate Roman control over such vast territories. And then, the political situation in Rome began to unravel for Lucullus. The tribune Gaius Manilius, supported by powerful financial interests who had been excluded from the profitable aspects of Eastern administration, began organizing legislative challenges to Lucullus's continued authority while promoting alternative commanders who promised more rapid and profitable resolution of the Eastern crisis. These domestic political maneuvers reflected broader tensions within Roman society about the proper scope of imperial expansion. The man who would replace Lucullus was already a legend, Pompey the Great, fresh from his spectacular success in eliminating Mediterranean pirate networks. His recent campaigns had demonstrated both his military capabilities and his capacity for achieving rapid, decisive results that satisfied public expectations while generating substantial financial returns for Roman investors. The Lex Manilia, proposed during 66 BC, would transfer supreme command of all eastern operations to Pompey, while providing him with unprecedented authority and resources to achieve final resolution of the Mithridatic threat. The legislation's supporters argued that the crisis required a commander with both proven military capabilities and sufficient political authority to coordinate operations across multiple theaters. Pompey's appointment was approved, and with it came the beginning of the end for Mithridates. Mithridates received intelligence about these Roman political developments through his extensive network of agents, allowing him to adjust strategic planning to exploit the transition period that would inevitably accompany any change in Roman command structure. The king recognized that Pompey's appointment would bring both enhanced Roman capabilities and potential opportunities, as the new commander would require time to familiarize himself with local conditions. But Pompey was not Lucullus. Where Lucullus had been methodical and cautious, Pompey was aggressive and decisive. Where Lucullus had advanced slowly, building supply lines and consolidating gains, Pompey struck quickly, accepting risks that his predecessor had carefully avoided. The contrast in styles would prove devastating for Mithridates. Pompey's first major operation was a lightning campaign that caught Pontic forces completely off guard. Rather than following the methodical siege warfare that had characterized Lucullus's campaigns, Pompey implemented rapid maneuver warfare that exploited Roman cavalry superiority and local intelligence to locate and destroy Pontic field forces before they could concentrate for effective resistance. The night battle near the Lycus River in 66 BC would become legendary. Roman forces attacked Pontic encampments in darkness, a tactic ancient armies rarely employed due to coordination challenges involved. But Pompey had trained his troops specifically for this operation, and the results were spectacular. Thousands of Pontic soldiers were killed or captured while still in their tents, their army disintegrating into panicked flight before effective resistance could be organized. Mithridates himself barely escaped, fleeing eastward with a small bodyguard. The strategic situation had collapsed with stunning speed. Within months of Pompey's arrival, virtually all of Mithridates' remaining strongholds in Anatolia had fallen. His Armenian ally Tigranes had submitted to Rome, and the king himself was reduced to a hunted fugitive in the Caucasus Mountains. But Mithridates still refused to surrender. Even in these reduced circumstances, his strategic mind continued to function with the same audacious vision that had characterized his entire career. Intelligence reports reaching his temporary headquarters during winter, 64 to 63 BC, described Roman forces scattered across their newly conquered territories, with Pompey himself having departed for Syria to complete his eastern reorganization. The king recognized that Roman control over his former domains remained tenuous, dependent on garrison forces that were insufficient to maintain permanent control over hostile populations. And so, he began planning something that would have seemed insane to any rational observer. A massive invasion of Italy itself, launched not from familiar territories of Asia Minor, but through the barbarian lands of Scythia and Gaul. Think about it. A 70-year-old king who had lost everything, planning to march an army of barbarian horsemen across thousands of miles of hostile territory to attack Rome itself. It was the kind of desperate, magnificent madness that only Mithridates could conceive. The plan envisioned coordinating with Gallic tribes, who had recently experienced Roman conquest under Caesar, uniting the tribal confederations of the northern steppes with Celtic peoples in a massive pincer movement against Italy. The audacity reflected both Mithridates' refusal to accept defeat and his sophisticated understanding of Roman strategic vulnerabilities. Such an invasion would force Rome to defend its heartland while maintaining control over newly conquered eastern territories. The logistical challenges were staggering, requiring coordination of diverse tribal groups across thousands of miles while maintaining operational security against Roman intelligence networks. Mithridates' emissaries traveled throughout Scythian territories during 64 BC, negotiating complex alliance agreements with tribal chieftains who possessed both military capabilities and geographic knowledge necessary for such an undertaking. The Sarmatian cavalry, renowned throughout the ancient world for their mobility and fighting prowess, represented the core of potential military support. But the very scope and complexity of these preparations created vulnerabilities that would prove decisive. The multinational character of his proposed alliance required extensive communication networks that were difficult to maintain securely across such vast distances, while diverse cultural and political traditions of potential allies created opportunities for misunderstanding and betrayal. More significantly, the time required to organize such an elaborate expedition allowed Roman intelligence services to gather information about Pontic activities while providing opportunities for domestic opponents within Mithridates' own court. Organize resistance to what many viewed as a suicidal venture. The growing opposition within the Pontic royal family reflected both practical concerns about the invasion plan's feasibility and deeper questions about the wisdom of continued resistance to Roman power. Pharnaces II, Mithridates' eldest surviving son and designated heir, had observed the systematic destruction of Pontic military power over previous decades, while witnessing the enormous human and material costs that continued resistance had imposed on their subjects. The philosophical and political differences between father and son had been developing for years before they erupted into open conflict. During 63 BC, Pharnaces represented a generation of Pontic nobility that had come of age during the long series of wars with Rome and had witnessed firsthand the consequences of challenging Roman military supremacy. The prince's analysis of their strategic position was devastatingly realistic. Roman control over the eastern Mediterranean had become so comprehensive that successful resistance would require resources and capabilities that Pontus no longer possessed. The tribal alliances that his father was attempting to construct might provide sufficient military strength for spectacular raids or even temporary territorial gains, but they could not sustain the kind of prolonged warfare that would be necessary to force Rome to accept meaningful concessions. More fundamentally, the demographic and economic foundations that had supported Pontic resistance during earlier phases had been systematically destroyed through decades of warfare, leaving insufficient population and resources to support another major military effort. Pharnaces' supporters argued that continued resistance would result in complete extinction of the Pontic royal dynasty and permanent enslavement or exile of their people. While negotiated submission to Roman authority might preserve at least some degree of autonomy and cultural continuity, the specific catalyst for open rebellion came during spring 63 BC, when Mithridates began implementing concrete preparations for the proposed invasion of Italy that required massive mobilization of Bosporan resources and population. The king's orders called for conscription of virtually every able-bodied male in Crimean territories, while simultaneously demanding unprecedented levels of taxation and resource requisition to fund the expedition's logistical requirements. These measures, which would have effectively destroyed the economic foundations of Bosporan society while exposing the civilian population to Roman retaliation, provided Pharnaces with both justification and popular support necessary to challenge his father's authority directly. The prince's initial moves against his father were carefully calculated to minimize bloodshed while maximizing the legitimacy of his rebellion within traditional Pontic political frameworks. Rather than attempting direct military confrontation, Pharnaces began by securing the loyalty of key military commanders and administrative officials who had grown disillusioned with the king's increasingly desperate strategic vision. The psychological impact of this familial betrayal on Mithridates was profound. The king had devoted enormous effort throughout his reign to preparing his sons for leadership responsibilities, providing them with the finest available education while ensuring their exposure to military and administrative challenges that would develop their capabilities as future rulers. The discovery that his designated heir had concluded that submission to Rome represented preferable policy to continued resistance struck at the core of everything Mithridates had believed about kingship, family loyalty, and the destiny of his dynasty. The siege of Panticapaeum began in late summer 63 BC, as forces loyal to Pharnaces established control over approaches to the city while demanding Mithridates' abdication in favor of his son's more realistic policies. The prince's supporters controlled most of the Crimean Peninsula's military resources, while their naval capabilities allowed them to prevent any possibility of external assistance reaching the beleaguered king. More significantly, the civilian population of the Bosporan cities had largely embraced Pharnaces' promise to end the conflict through negotiated settlement with Rome, viewing continued resistance as a path to inevitable destruction rather than glorious victory. Mithridates' final weeks were characterized by a combination of desperate military planning and profound psychological isolation. The king's attempts to rally loyal forces were frustrated by the comprehensive nature of his son's rebellion, while his efforts to negotiate some form of compromise were rejected by Pharnaces, who recognized that any agreement short of complete abdication would leave the fundamental conflict unresolved. And then came that cold December morning we started with. The dramatic circumstances of Mithridates' death would become the subject of numerous ancient accounts that emphasized both the king's personal courage and the tragic irony of his final moments. Contemporary sources describe his discovery that the various toxins he had ingested throughout his life to prevent assassination had created such immunity to poison that he could not achieve the dignified suicide that ancient tradition prescribed for defeated monarchs. His attempts to end his life through conventional poisoning proved ineffective. Can you imagine the horror, the frustration? Decades of carefully building immunity to prevent enemies from poisoning him, and now that very immunity prevented him from controlling even his own death. The irony would be almost comical if it weren't so tragic, finally forcing him to request assistance from Bituitus, his loyal Gallic bodyguard, who had remained faithful despite the general abandonment of his cause. The image of the great king, who had once commanded vast armies and controlled territories spanning continents, reduced to begging a barbarian mercenary for the final service of death, provided a powerful symbol of the transience of earthly power and the ultimate futility of resistance to Roman destiny. The irony that his legendary immunity to poison developed as protection against his enemies ultimately prevented him from escaping the consequences of his final defeat added an element of cosmic justice that appealed to ancient sensibilities about divine retribution. The immediate aftermath of Mithridates' death saw Pharnaces move quickly to consolidate control over remaining Pontic territories, while initiating diplomatic contacts with Rome that would secure recognition of his legitimacy. Define the terms of Pontic submission. The new king's first acts included execution of remaining supporters of his father's war policies and systematic dismantling of military preparations that had been underway for the proposed Italian invasion. The negotiations between Pharnaces and Roman representatives proceeded through intermediaries during early months of 62 BC. Pompey, still engaged in organizing eastern settlements that would define Roman policy in the region for generations, recognized that Bosporan cooperation could provide valuable assistance in maintaining control over Black Sea trade routes while reducing military commitments necessary to secure Roman interests. The territorial arrangements that concluded the Mithridatic Wars left Pharnaces in control of the Crimean Bosporus and certain adjacent territories, but under conditions that made his kingdom effectively a Roman client state whose foreign policy would be determined by Roman interests rather than independent calculation. The new king retained authority over internal administration and local military forces, but was prohibited from conducting independent diplomatic relations with other powers, while being required to provide military assistance to Roman operations when requested. So what does it all mean? What lessons can we draw from this epic tale of ambition, resistance, and ultimate defeat? The Mithridatic Wars represent a crucial watershed in ancient history, marking the end of the Hellenistic period that had begun with Alexander's conquests and the emergence of Roman imperial dominance that would characterize the Mediterranean world for the next 5 centuries. Mithridates' death in the remote Crimean territories where his ancestors had first established their power provided a fitting conclusion to the last serious attempt to preserve Eastern independence against Roman expansion. The king's extraordinary career, spanning from his youthful exile in the Pontic Mountains to his final desperate plans for invading Italy itself, embodied both the possibilities and limitations of individual resistance to imperial power, while demonstrating the historical forces that would ultimately transform the ancient world from a collection of independent kingdoms and city-states into a unified empire governed from Rome. The military lessons learned during the extended Eastern campaigns revolutionized Roman approaches to siege warfare, logistics, and provincial defense in ways that would influence imperial strategy for centuries. The sophisticated fortifications encountered in Pontic cities forced Roman engineers to develop new techniques for undermining defensive walls and coordinating complex assault operations. These technical advances became standard elements of Roman military engineering that would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns throughout the empire. But perhaps more importantly, the Mithridatic Wars demonstrated the necessity of professional military leadership capable of conducting complex operations across extended time periods without the constraints of annual magistracies that had traditionally limited Roman strategic planning. The extraordinary commands granted to Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey established precedents for concentrating military and civilian authority in single individuals who possessed both the expertise and continuity necessary for effective Eastern administration. These arrangements, while successful in achieving military objectives, created constitutional innovations that fundamentally altered the relationship between military commanders and civilian government in ways that would prove decisive in the Republic's eventual transformation. The precedent of marching on Rome, set by Sulla during the First Mithridatic War, would be followed by others, including a certain Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon with his legions. The concentration of power in the hands of successful generals, the use of military force to resolve domestic political disputes, the precedent that constitutional niceties could be suspended in times of crisis. All these lessons learned during the Mithridatic Wars would contribute directly to the Republic's transformation into an empire. And what of Mithridates himself? How should we remember the Poison King? He was a monster, certainly responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent civilians in the Ephesian Vespers, a massacre that ranks among the great atrocities of ancient history. He was a tyrant who tolerated no opposition, who had his own mother and brother killed, who ordered the execution of countless enemies, real and imagined. But he was also one of the most remarkable figures of the ancient world, a polyglot who reportedly spoke 22 languages fluently, a military innovator who understood logistics and strategy at levels that rivaled the greatest Roman commanders, a survivor who transformed himself from a hunted boy king into the last great champion of Eastern independence against Roman imperialism. He held off the greatest military power the world had ever known for nearly 30 years, not through superior resources or technology, but through intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Even at the end, even when all was lost, he was planning one final desperate gambit to strike at Rome itself. In many ways, Mithridates represents the last gasp of the Hellenistic world, that brilliant fusion of Greek and Persian culture that had dominated the East since Alexander. His defeat marked the end of an era when kingdoms could maintain genuine independence, when alternatives to Roman power still existed, when the Mediterranean world was still a place of competing powers rather than a single empire. After Mithridates, no Eastern ruler would seriously challenge Roman supremacy for centuries. The next real threat to Rome would come not from sophisticated Hellenistic monarchies, but from barbarian migrations and internal decay. The age of the god-kings who could face Rome as equals had ended, and yet his legacy lived on. The practice of Mithridatism, building immunity through gradual exposure to toxins, would be studied and practiced throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The strategic lessons learned fighting his armies would shape Roman military doctrine for generations. The administrative structures created to govern his former territories would become templates for provincial organization throughout the empire. Most importantly, Mithridates demonstrated something that would inspire resistance movements throughout Roman history: that Rome could be defied, that Roman armies could be defeated, that the apparently unstoppable machine of Roman conquest had weaknesses that could be exploited by determined and intelligent opposition. He lost, ultimately. They all lost. Everyone who challenged Rome during its ascendancy lost. But in losing, Mithridates VI, Eupator, the Poison King, the last great enemy of Republican Rome, achieved a kind of immortality that more successful rulers never attained. His story became legend. His resistance became an inspiration. His refusal to submit, even in the face of overwhelming odds, became a testament to human defiance in the face of imperial power. On that cold December morning in 63 BC, when the sword finally fell and ended the Poison King's long struggle, more than just a man died. An entire era ended. The Hellenistic Age, that brief, brilliant period when Greek culture and Eastern power combined to create something unique in human history, breathed its last. The Mediterranean world that had been so diverse, so culturally rich, so politically complex, would be progressively homogenized under Roman rule. The grand strategic competition between multiple great powers would give way to Pax Romana peace through overwhelming military supremacy. Was it inevitable? The resources Rome could mobilize, the disciplined efficiency of Roman military organization, the relentless expansion of Roman power, all these factors made the eventual outcome nearly certain. But Mithridates proved it wasn't foreordained. He showed that with intelligence, preparation, and ruthless determination, even the greatest empire could be challenged, bloodied, forced to fight for every inch of territory. And in the end, isn't that worth something? In the end, doesn't the fact that he tried, that he fought, that he never surrendered, matter more than the ultimate outcome? History remembers the victors, yes, but it also remembers those who refused to accept defeat, who fought on when all rational calculation said the cause was hopeless, who chose death over submission. Mithridates the Great, the Poison King, beloved of his father, the terror of Rome, the last king of Pontus, died as he had lived, defiant, unbowed, planning impossible victories even in the moment of final defeat. And in dying, he achieved what all his armies and all his poison and all his strategic brilliance could never accomplish. He became immortal. The Mithridatic Wars were over. The Roman Republic stood triumphant over the wreckage of the last Hellenistic kingdom. But the precedents set, the constitutional innovations implemented, the concentration of power in the hands of successful generals, all these would soon transform the victorious republic into something else entirely. Pompey, who had finally defeated Mithridates, would himself fall to Caesar. Caesar would fall to assassins. The assassins would fall to Octavian. And Octavian, taking the name Augustus, would finally bury the Roman Republic that had fought so hard to defeat the Poison King. In a way, Mithridates won after all. The republic he fought never survived him by more than 3 decades. The constitutional system he challenged transformed into the very kind of monarchical autocracy he represented. The cycle of history, it seems, has a sense of irony. Sleep well, Poison King. Your wars are over, but your legend, that will echo through the centuries, testament to the eternal human spirit that refuses to bow, refuses to break, refuses to surrender even when all hope is lost and death itself comes knocking.